current situation. My name is Pınar Gezgeç, and I am the International Programs Coordinator for Atlas Grad Institute, and I will also be moderating today's webinar. I wanted to start off by thanking you all for joining today and having the chance to hear from our speakers on the topic of COVID-19 and its impact on the international education system, as it is a sensitive topic in today's world. I would like to briefly start off by introducing Atlas Grad Institute. Our staff here is dedicated by advancing practical ideas to address the world's greatest challenges. As a global institute, it's our mission to empower future generations with interdisciplinary knowledge and skills, creativity and values that are essential for leading in a global context and making a difference in the world. As of right now, our headquarters is in Washington, D.C., but we also do have a branch located in Istanbul, Turkey, which is where I am connecting in from, and so is some of our panelists. In hope of giving enough time for the discussion, I would like to go ahead and briefly introduce our speakers, as we do have a distinguished group of experts joining us today. Joining us from the US, we have Professor Fernando Reimers. Professor Reimers is the Ford Foundation Professor of the Practice International Education and Director of the Global Education Innovation Initiative and the International Education Policy Program at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Thank you, Professor Reimers, for joining us today. Next, we have Professor Douglas Harris, who is a professor and chair of the Department of Economics at Tulane University, and the, pardon me if I say this wrong, Schlickers Foundation Chair in Public Education. Welcome, Professor Harris. Joining us from Istanbul, Turkey, we have Professor Hürriyet Çetinok, who is a specialized physician in anatomy and who is also a faculty member of the medicine department of Atlas University. And last but not least, we have Professor Jale Göktepe, who is the head of science department of Koç School and is familiar with creating different projects for K-12 level students. We thank you all again for taking the time to participate in this webinar. So to go ahead and summarize the topic for today's webinar, as you all know, COVID-19 has shaken up the whole world. As people are trying to fight this disease, we also witness shifts in our daily lives due to the global pandemic. With the sudden global lockdown of education institutions, there was an interruption in the students' learning platform at all levels of education in different regions. The cancellation of in-class teaching and the move to online classes have impacted the world's student population as well as the academic agenda. With experts from different levels of education from around the world, we will take a look into the challenges and new approaches the educational sectors are facing currently as schools are preparing to reopen for the 2020-2021 academic school year. On that note, we will begin the panel with a discussion and conclude with final remarks and a Q&A session. Just a reminder for our panelists, please have your mic on mute while others are talking. We do have a live streaming for today's webinar, on our social media platforms. So make sure to follow us and use the hashtag @AtlasGradWebinar2020 to tag us. And for a full recording of today's webinar, it will be posted on our social media platforms within the week. During the panel, our audience can also submit questions as we will try to get to them at the end of the discussion. And with that, I would like to go ahead and begin our panel by asking our first question. So, as the majority of us know, schools have decided to continue the school in the in-person and/or online. For institutes who have decided on splitting the school days half online and what differences are the teachers and/or the institutes doing differently in order to keep themselves and the students safe? We can go ahead and start off with Professor Reimers.
Thank you very much for the invitation. I'm delighted to be with you, and I'm glad that the Atlas Institute has convened this conversation about the impact and the possibilities created by this pandemic for universities. But I'd like to start putting this question in context. This is a terrible moment for humanity. 36 million people have been infected by this virus, more than 1 million have died, and this pandemic is going to have all kinds of ripple effects throughout the world. The World Bank has estimated that the coming year, 20 million people are going to be thrown into extreme poverty. This pandemic is going to interact with all kinds of pre-existing challenges, creating a world that is more unstable and more dangerous and more fragile and more unequal. In that context, I think it is very important that each and every one of the 28,000 universities around the world asks, what is our responsibility in this moment of crisis? When we look historically at the impact of pandemics, I think about the pandemic of 1918. That pandemic brought to Germany the rise of fascism, because the pandemic constrained the ability of municipalities to fund public services, and that threw a lot of people to the margins of society. And many of those people became intolerant, and those people were captured by extremely intolerant groups with hateful ideologies that convinced them that the blame for their misfortunes was in others. And Adolf Hitler gave himself to the task of building a coalition, and in 12 years since the pandemic arrived in Germany, he was elected Chancellor of Germany. I do not know whether this pandemic is going to result in the breakdown of democracy throughout the world, but I am certain that it is going to create all kinds of challenges. And for that reason, I think universities, which are relatively more privileged educational institutions than any other education level, have the responsibility, the obligation to ask themselves, what should we do? So in that context, I think that the pandemic gives us an opportunity in higher education to actually teach our students what it means to lead, what it means to take responsibility. I will give you an example. I direct a master's program in education policy, as you have mentioned. I reached out to my graduates, many of whom are working for governments, for international development organizations. And I said, I think it's very important that we take stock of how this pandemic is impacting educational opportunities for poor children. Because I think what is at stake is the possibility of the collapse of educational opportunity for the children of the poor around the world. What is at stake is that we may lose the gains made over the last several decades in including more and more children in education. And in a relatively short period of time, we published this book, Leading Education Through COVID-19, in which we take stock of the current education crisis, but we also talk about what are the avenues to mitigate the impact of the pandemic in the current moment and in the immediate aftermath. In my course in education policy, for example, 2/3 of my students are working, consulting with governments at various levels, at a city level, state level, national level throughout the world, asking how can we help you put in place strategies of educational opportunity, continuity. So I think this pandemic is a tragic moment for most people. We have not seen the worst of its impacts. I think we have to brace for a very difficult and challenging world. But in that context, universities have, as they always have, at least the modern universities, an opportunity and an obligation to be of service to society, especially to be of service, not to look at their navel, not just to their students, but to those who do not have an opportunity to go to university.
Thank you, Professor Reimers. That was great insight. Did anyone else want to go ahead and also add in comments for this question? Professor Harris, did you want to say, have any comments?
I think Professor
Professor Göktepe, go ahead.
Okay. Thank you. First of all, I'd like to thank you all for your invitation. It's a big pleasure to be here with you all. Yeah, we know this pandemic period caused massive socioeconomic problems. Education systems around the world were revised, and it had to be revised and adapted to ensure education continuity and to protect the safety of the learners and all the other education actors by closing schools and other learning spaces. And we also did, as Koç School, we also did our best to adapt to this new normal. I want to highlight the new normal with an example. If you don't mind, I'm going to read this part because I took this from an article. Martin Kulldorff, professor of medicine at Harvard Medical, who is leading figure in the field of infectious disease epidemiology, argues for an age-targeted response to COVID-19 pandemic. And he states that there is an enormous difference of risk for older people, and for children, the risks are much less than the annual flu. So he states that we don't close schools because of annual flu. We don't ban people from driving cars because there are people who die in car accidents. We just let people to live normal lives with standard precautions. So what does he mean, or what do we mean by saying standard precautions? If we think the major components of a school or education system, other than the curriculum, what comes to our minds, into my mind actually, transportation of students to school from home to school, or from school to home, transportation, meals, toilets, classes, usage of digital tools, school building itself. So what we have done in order to keep ourselves and our students safe, first of all, service buses are organized in the best way. And we all learned spontaneously, I think, as mankind, we all learned how to stop the spread of microorganisms. And we all learned about the importance of the personal hygiene, about social distance, about using masks and disinfectants. And we also, as school, we also developed new policies for the usage of lunchroom, for instance. We made separators for each person, for each student. We produced some plexiglass separators in order to keep them in a safe environment during the lunchtime. And teacher offices also. Every single room of the school is decorated with the new safety documents, safety items, maybe I can say. So I like this saying. I want to say, wrap up with a sentence from Darwin. In this pandemic period, I think, as Darwin states, not the strongest, but the most adaptable to change will survive. So I think we did our best to adapt to this new normal, and I hope we will not have any problem in future. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Göktepe. Professor Harris, did you want to go ahead and add any more comments?
Sure. So thanks for having me. Just add on to those helpful comments. I think one of the things the comments highlight is how different people and also different countries will be affected in different ways by this. I think you have some places, more elite and well-funded institutions that will be okay. They can borrow money. They will still have students coming their way, able to pay tuition and so on. Where the university where I work, Tulane University, has the resources to build temporary classrooms and reconfigure all the rooms, the technology to be able to do hybrid learning, to teach simultaneously in person and remotely. It was really quite remarkable what they were able to do here. The testing regime, like the university itself has its own testing regime and created its own COVID tests, and all the students are being tested every week. But very few places are going to have that luxury. So Tulane is an elite and well-resourced university, even for the United States. And then you think about other countries where the resources are much lower. That's going to be a much more difficult situation. But even in the U.S., we have a lot of colleges where they were already on the cusp of failing and financially, and so it's likely to drive, I would say, hundreds of colleges into closure. You also have the public versus private institutions where government budgets are going to be taking a big hit, and in the U.S. The government's been paying less and less of the cost of higher education for decades, with more money going into healthcare and to other services and other important public needs, where higher education just hasn't been seen as a necessity anymore. And so that's the first thing to go when times get tough. And now times are going to be tough for a while. We haven't really seen the full effect of it yet, because the federal government has stepped in with some additional funding, both to prop up the economy and to prop up budgets for colleges and other public institutions. But that's not going to last for long, and this is going to be a long-term economic problem. We're likely to see 4 or 5 years of slow economic growth, meaning less revenue, fewer students going to college, That's going to be unfortunate both for the colleges, but also for the students themselves in the long run. And then you think about countries, lower income countries, where they were already just barely able to get by and being able to fund education at just a very basic level. And countries like that can't borrow as easily as the U.S. Can borrow and shift funds to fill in the gap. So I think by country it's going to be very different. And then you've got students who are in very different situations. Again, higher income families have not been as hard hit by this, especially in the U.S. Lower income families are taking the hardest hit, partly because of the kinds of jobs that they have are the ones that are most likely to end as a result of a pandemic. And then you put on top of that the difficulties of remote learning. Even for those families that are able to keep their jobs, that means that the children are often learning at home, but they're not home. So they don't have the resources. They probably don't have internet connections. They don't have the ability to just move everything home the way they can move it in a higher income country and higher income families within those countries.
Thank you, Professor Harris. Any additional comments?
Yeah, one more.
Yes, go ahead, Professor Çetinok.
Good afternoon and good morning, everybody. And thank you for giving this opportunity to meet my colleagues and everybody. So I just want to say this is a very hard time for all over the world. So we cannot say this is just affect the educational system or health system. It affects people psychologically. And as we know, we are social human beings. Human beings are different from others because we are socialized. So for me, I'm an academician, I'm a faculty, and I'm a mother. Two of my kids in the United States, and my kids are still continuing their education in the United States, and I'm here for my students and for science. Gonna fight with disease, and during that time we have to learn how we're gonna live with this condition. And at that time the life is going, so we keep to give our education to students, and we always try to support them. Before this panel, I meet hundreds of my students, and I'm trying to give them psychological support also. So what we do, as we come to your question, what we do differently from our campus is a very big campus here, and we do the regular precautions here, but what we did differently, we check QR codes before the students enter the campus. What is it? In Turkey we have HES system, so it means who gonna be has restrictions or who gonna be affected before. So we're gonna take them far away from the campus or the other students or the faculty. So, and then we have another thing. We have hybrid learning classes here. So that means, as for medical education, online education is different. So, and it's very hard for us. So we're gonna give the opportunity which students are safe for themselves and keep take their measures for themselves, so they can come to the campus and they can take their lectures in our hybrid classes also. And we have, the other regular precautions, but that's the most important thing. First, we have to be calm, and we have to learn how we're gonna live and fight with this, and we don't know what's waiting us in the future. So that's all I just want to say. Thank you very much.
Thank you all for that. So as we can see, this whole, COVID-19 has definitely shaken up the entire world. So for our next question, I wanted to go ahead and ask Professor Douglas, as you were already mentioning the topic of economy and the struggles that, it's already going through with COVID-19. So as a professor of economics, I'm sure you're able to elaborate more. As we can see, it doesn't matter where we are. All of the education systems have been impacted, but most importantly, for both students and colleges, the coronavirus has created a massive disruption in the financial norm of higher education. with schools closing, switching to solely to online, reconstruction classes, cutting costs, and so much more. There has been even lost revenue to partial tuition refunds, room and board fees. Just as I was reading before, universities such as the University of Arizona and University of Michigan, who have estimated a loss of over $200 million. We should ask the question of how financial implications can impact will be felt by institutions of all sizes and forms.
Well, so you know, there's going to be a loss of revenue in a couple different ways. One is through loss of public revenue, which has been happening anyway. And again, that hasn't been fully felt yet. But again, over the next 4 or 5 years, you'll see substantial cuts in the public institutions, especially the ones you don't hear about, the regional public institutions they're not as well known, but are actually the ones that serve the most students. Also community colleges, which serve students towards more vocationally oriented degrees. Those institutions are going to get hurt by this the most, because they're the ones most dependent on public revenue. On the other hand, the flip side of this is that there aren't going to be a lot of jobs in the short term. So students are, for the most part, still going to come. You know, we see some drop in total enrollment so far, but not much, because you think about the decision to go to college and stay in college is partly dependent on what your other opportunities are. And so if you can find a good job, then you're less likely to go to college. Well, now there are not going to be a lot of good jobs for a while. So I don't think it's going to be, on the average, catastrophic because of that incentive. Students realize the importance of going to college, and that the importance of higher education, I think, is not lost on anybody, and that hasn't changed, and that's a good thing. And so people will, while we wait for the economy to recover and wait for other opportunities to emerge, people will attend college and try to develop their skills and knowledge and be ready for when those opportunities arise. So again, I think it's more about particular colleges in particular countries and particular students that are going to be hurt. On average, I don't think it's going to be catastrophic. I hope the concerns about democracy and so on that Professor Reimers was suggesting, I hope that those don't occur. Those are less in my area of expertise, but I could certainly imagine those kinds of problems emerging that are maybe a little bit more detached from higher education, more the societal effect of COVID. But I think higher education will remain strong and remain important, because it was before, and there's no reason to think that will change, I don't think.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor Harris. If there's any additional comments, if not, I can go ahead and go into the next question. So for our next question, education can be known as an essential factor for all countries around the world. However, in some regions, education is still a work in process, even before the pandemic. Do you all think that closing off schools and adopting distance learning runs a risk of setting countries such as the US and Turkey a step back or a step forward in terms of education? We can go ahead and start off with Professor Çetinok, if that is okay.
So it is not easy to, after this pandemic, it is not going to be easy. So adapting the normal lifestyle is going to take time. So I mentioned before, it's going to be affect persons psychologically. So, you restricted elder or children age, and they're going to stay at home, or they're going to do their education on the online. So it's not more effective, I think. For my side, if I'm going to talk about medicine, I'm a human anatomist, so our material is cadavers, and yeah, we have lots of learning systems, 3D, 4D, or other things, but it is not the same, because if a person, I'm talking my side, going to be a physician, yeah, he can or she can get all the knowledge from internet or online, but how they're going to do their practice. So yeah, as soon as possible, we have to go back to the regular educational system, and we have to take our precautions, because otherwise, you know, I'm just lots of worries about this, because our material is human body, and we have to know the body structures, feelings, heartbeats, or other things. And we can take something from online or other materials, but we need to go the real educational system. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Did anyone else want to go ahead and add any comments?
Yeah, I don't think there is an easy way to answer the question as to whether this pandemic is going to mean a step forward or backward. Certainly for individuals, the evidence is that any sustained interruption in their education and learning loss and disengagement for education has lifelong consequences for individuals that are not positive. For institutions, I guess it depends on how leaders of those institutions respond to the moment. And let me put things in perspective. World War II was a tragic event for humanity, right? Huge cost, human lives, 60 million people, huge cost in infrastructure. And yet there were leaders immediately after the war who used the moment to actually build something good. For example, just at the end of the war, November 1945, a group of leaders of European nations, looking at the devastation the war had caused in infrastructure and in educational institutions, said, why don't we create a mechanism to collaborate, to help recover, to help build back better? And they created an organization called UNESCO, which took it upon itself to advance the right to education around the world, and which produced a remarkable silent revolution. At that time in history, with humanity consisting of 2.5 billion people, only 45% of humanity had ever gone to school. 7 decades later, when humanity, total world population 7.5 billion, 95% have gone to school. You look at the trajectories, there is a clear increase in the slope of growth. And it's evident that the creation of the Bretton Woods institutions, which is a product of World War II, it's not a product of World War II, it's a product of what leaders did in the face of the devastation caused by the war, had a tremendous positive impact in humanity, in lifting the conditions of people. In the US, the bill that made it possible for people who had come from the war to go to college produced one of the most significant expansions in access to opportunity in the United States. So similarly, at the moment, what impact this has on institutions is going to depend on what leaders of institutions do. I am at the moment doing a study of how 25 universities around the world are responding to the pandemic, in particular, in terms of engaging with K-12 systems. I'm looking at whether universities step up and say, I actually have something to offer. In the US, I'm studying Arizona State University and MIT. And I can tell you that irrespective of level of resources and institutional capacities, I'm certainly looking at institutions like MIT that are very well funded, and Arizona State University is a public university whose greatest asset, I would say, is phenomenal leadership and a president who actually has a vision of the role that university can play as an engine of economic and social development in its society. If each of our university presidents in the 28,000 universities around the world had the same vision and the same capacity for leadership, I think we could use this crisis as an opportunity to actually become more relevant. In the United States, universities have for some time now been struggling with the question of what is their purpose. After they embraced the purpose of democratizing access, which has really stagnated now for some time, they've been in search for the question of purpose. And that is in part of the core of why, for the first time, certainly in my lifetime, people are asking, well, what value do universities ask for society? It's a terrible thing to be witnessing, but to some extent, it is a function not only of where the public is, it is a function of where universities are. So this is an opportunity to show what value universities actually add to society, to step out of our comfort zone, to go beyond serving our immediate constituencies, and to demonstrate that we can actually, as we would in a war, as we would in the face of a major natural calamity like an earthquake, that we actually are one of the resources that is essential. If you look at the history of the modern research university, charter in 1811 in Berlin by William Humboldt, this university is sister of two other institutions, the public school and democracy. And it was created as one of the institutions of the Enlightenment to actually advance a world that was ruled by reason, that empower individuals to take care of their lives, to improve their circumstances, and to associate with others in improving the communities of which they are a part. And if you look at the charter of the University of Berlin, it had 3 goals. Goal number 1 was to advance truth. And that's why it was so important to create the conditions where, as opposed to transmitting dogma, which is what universities used to do until then. Goal number 2 was to promote individuals who were capable of thinking critically, of having their own ideas. And goal number 3 was to enlighten society, not just the people who came to the university, which in 1811 was a very small proportion. The United States took that idea and perfected it with a vengeance, particularly in our land-grant institutions, and actually for a while build institutions that actually advance those 3 ideals. So I think this is a time to go back to our history, to ask what is our mission, and to ask how can we be of service to society. I agree with Professor Harris that some institutions, it's going to be easier for them to do that than for others because of their endowments, because of their situation. But I really think that the most critical asset at this moment is leadership. I certainly observe institutions that are very well endowed and that don't really have particularly enlightened leadership, who are kind of hiding under the table, waiting for someone else to solve the problem. And I see other institutions that don't have the same level of material resources, but that have good leadership, that are doing really extraordinary things. And my guess, I mean, I don't know, we have no playbook to see where pandemics lead us, but I have a sense that when this is over and people look back, I mean, more than 5 years from now, 10, 20 years from now, when people look at this moment and what each of us did at this moment of crisis, those institutions that actually led, that actually ask themselves the question of how can I make sure that I advance the well-being of the communities of which I'm a part, are going to be recognized as the institutions that actually led. You know, to go back to another historical example, look at the pandemic, what's called the bubonic plague or the Black Death in Italy, 14th century. Terrible thing. In 2 years, wiped out 1/3 of the population of Italy. And, you know, 3 decades later, you see the beginning of the Renaissance. And there is actually a connection, rather indirect, less direct than for the rise of fascism in Germany, which there's a very nice recent paper published by the Federal Reserve Board of New York that actually through econometric analysis shows the causal connection between the reducing municipal spending and the radicalization of people. So there isn't anything of that level of evidence looking at the impact of the pandemic in Italy, but we do know that one of the consequences of that pandemic is it caused people to ask, to look around and to look at a society where government was very corrupt, religious institutions were very corrupt, and the immediate response was no good. You had these little feuds in the citadels in the cities, spending the money they didn't have in wars. And the leaders of one of those cities, Florence, did something that was absolutely contrarian. Instead, they decided we're not going to have an army. We're actually going to invest our money in building this city. They invested in the arts. They invested in sciences. So the Medicis were an extremely enlightened family. And that's why you see in that little city the convergence of people like Machiavelli, like Leonardo da Vinci, like Raphael, like Michelangelo. And people who have studied this period call that the Medici Effect, which is the result of concentrating in a relatively small place a lot of talent. Good things came of that. What came out of that was the Renaissance, the Italian Renaissance. So I think the universities are in a possibility of, to some extent, they are these citadels that concentrate people, that concentrate talent in a place. This is a time to show that this talent actually has value to society.
Thank you so much, Professor Reimers. That was great insight. Did anyone else go ahead? Professor Göktepe, go ahead. The floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. I was very excited while I was listening to Mr. Reimers because the thing that I'm thinking or I want to articulate now, quite similar to what he said. Of course, school closures affected 40 million children worldwide, and they are still missing a stimulating and enriching environment, learning opportunities and social interaction, especially those children from poor and disadvantaged families. So I think, as Mr. Professor mentioned, there should be a way of helping these families and their kids. for instance, in my school, a private school, we don't have these problems. No internet problem, no digital tools or any other stuff. But I think even myself as a teacher, looking for different ways of helping these people. I'm trying to set some, or maybe run some projects like social responsibility projects. I'm trying to find some ways, some connections. I'm trying to get in touch with people who can help me, but not raising money, not getting money from people. I just want to give the tablet, iPad, or the computer, or the other things, maybe access to some internet. I want to give directly to these missing items to those kids. As a teacher, as a single person, as an individual, if I'm doing this, I think the institutions and companies should think, should do more things, better things than me. As Professor mentioned, yes, we should take this pandemic as an advantage. How? Because if we don't do something, if we don't run campaigns, or if you don't do some, if you don't touch these people, then there will be more gap between the kids who have advantages and the kids, disadvantaged family kids. So in order to get rid of this gap, we have to do something, take an action. And not only individuals, institutions, companies, we should come together to touch these people. This is the only way that will help us, I believe.
I agree.
One of the ways that will help us.
And my suggestion is universities shouldn't engage in activities that are outside the realm of expertise. I think that through the three activities that are core to the university, advancing knowledge, educating students, and extension, we can do what you're describing. Let me give you an example. I've just placed on the chat a link to an article, a short article that I published in Inside Higher Education a few weeks ago, in which I talk about this issue. And the Times Higher Education had an article recently that I published on the same ideas. So let me give you an example. For the last 6 months, I've been collaborating with partners at the World Bank, at the OECD, and at other organizations, looking at how the pandemic has impacted public education systems, and also looking at what are some outliers, what are some examples, positive deviants, what are different jurisdictions at different levels doing to respond to that. And we've produced a number of things. We've done surveys and we've done case studies. And we've produced 30 case studies that document what the city of Bogota did, what the state of Sao Paulo did, what the country of Colombia did in response to the pandemic. And the utilization of that knowledge has been phenomenal if we count just the number of downloads. Why is that? Because there isn't enough of it, and because governments around the world are desperate for ideas. So one suggestion I have for what any university could do is look around at, number one, what impact is this pandemic having? What is being done, look for ways to evaluate the impact of those things, and then disseminate that knowledge. And then the other thing that universities can do is they can convene people. This Saturday, I organized a conference on the impact of COVID on education. I reached out to 300 of my former graduates, and we invited the president of Ethiopia, who's also the chairwoman of the UNESCO Commission on the Futures of Education. I invited the Director of Education at UNESCO, of the World Bank, at USAID, and we spent a day examining what impact is this pandemic having around the world and what can we do. And just bringing 300 people together, which we can actually do very easy online, much easier than in the past, because people don't have to travel. They don't have to take the time to go to a place. Just that conversation is immensely valuable for each participant. This is something that is within the reach of just about any university that has access to an online platform and a network of former students that are doing something interesting in the world that you can bring together.
Just a quick elaboration there. I think Professor Reimers brings up the effects and possible silver linings of disasters. And I think here in New Orleans, Louisiana, we had Hurricane Katrina about 15 years ago. And I've thought about what's happening now in terms of COVID in those terms. In fact, we studied the effects of the storm on the education system and so on. One of the interesting things that I think we learned from that was that disasters force you to do things you wouldn't do otherwise. So in the case of Katrina, when people were coming back to the city, at first, they had to allow people to choose schools. So normally in the United States, you would attend the public school in your neighborhood, but you couldn't do that after the storm because people were coming back in very uneven patterns, and a lot of the school buildings had been destroyed. And if you're really going to have everybody have an opportunity to attend school, then you had to allow them to just pick whatever school they wanted. And so they shifted to that system. They would have never done that otherwise. But then after a few years, that just became the system. And so now that, along with many other changes in the school system, remain in place 15 years later. They would have never done that if not for the storm. Whether it's a good thing or not is we can have a separate debate on that. But I think the larger point is that we're being forced to do different things. And I think the example that Professor Reimers gives is another good one. So now we're being forced to do things online that we would have never done online before. And what we're learning is that it creates some opportunities that we didn't really think about, right? We can bring together large groups of people almost instantly with very little planning. I had all these events planned over this coming year that would have involved people traveling all over to try to get to a place. It's very hard to organize those events. Well, we just put them online, and everything's a lot easier now. We can actually bring more people and involve more people than we could have in the past. And the technology is actually relatively inexpensive. So I think a larger theme is that higher education is being forced to integrate technology into the learning process in ways that never would have occurred before, and not just in the classroom, but in creating networks of people that you couldn't have created otherwise as well. So I think that's something that colleges are being forced to do. In some cases, there will be universities that have great leadership, as Professor Reimers says, that will take more advantage of these. But I think a lot of it's just going to be a natural pressure now, that it's not going to be as dependent on pressure, that the students themselves, that faculty will be bringing these things into their experience and into their activities just on their own accord. So I think you will see changes and some positive changes for that reason.
Okay, perfect. Thank you all. So, Professor Reimers, you mentioned to everyone that you just published on the topic of leading education through COVID-19, and again, a big congratulations to you. Hopefully, all of us will get a chance to be able to go ahead and read it. I wanted to go ahead and ask, do you think that distance learning practices will undermine the importance attached to the education sector in the long run? For example, do you think that society will start viewing education as something as not as indispensable to human development as before?
No, not at all. And I think that there is already a long-term trend where it's clear that there's a need for more opportunities to help people throughout their lives gain new knowledge and skills. So there has been a need for some time for someone to step up into the area of lifelong education. Now that, of course, is a challenge to the mission that most universities have traditionally embraced, which is to engage post-adolescents and invest in them, hoping that foundation would prepare them for a career. That market, certainly in the United States, is declining simply because of demographic, and the way in which some of our universities had adjusted to that reality was, rather than reinventing new products, was to looking for students elsewhere. So we have universities that are highly dependent on international students, A, because there are many more of them, right? 9 out of 10 young people live in the developing world. But B, because they found it easier to kind of reach out to a new group of customers as opposed to creating a new set of products for the customers that they had. I think that need is going to be accelerated. I mean, it was really being accelerated by the development of artificial intelligence and by globalization and trade, that people need to gain new knowledge and new skills so that they can continue to participate economically in a world where the demands keep changing. The pandemic has only accelerated that, because we're going to move in, you look at these, all the economic engines of the world have been shut down at the same time. And so you can predict what this impact is going to be. Just look at restaurants in the US. Half of them are going to go under in the next few years. Yeah, eventually they will pop up again as there is demand for those services. But I do not know whether this is going to produce a very long-term depression, but I think it is going to produce a recession worldwide that probably will be tougher than the recession of the early 1980s and of the early 2000s. And in that kind of context, the need for upskilling is greater. Now, people may not be willing to pay what they have been paying for in initial education. So there is the innovation challenge. Universities are challenged to A, create new products at a different cost. Is that possible? Yes, there are already institutions that were doing this. The way in which some universities have been experimenting. Look at MIT, for example. The growth in MIT during the pandemic of opportunities for online, what they call professional education, short courses. I've been following that because we at Harvard are also paying attention to that market. How do we help people? For example, companies have a tremendous need for individuals with the capacity to develop a digital strategy. Well, you know what? A lot of people don't know how to do that, but you can learn that. MIT is offering a program, a course that for $12,000 will prepare you to do that. It's not an MBA, it's not a BA, it's a degree that someone who already has that education, it's a course that they could take and say, okay, I can reinvent myself. Universities are in great need right now of people who can help them develop a digital strategy. So I think that this crisis is creating new opportunities for universities. And some universities will have the leadership and the capacity, the internal capacity to respond to that. So no, I don't think the value of education will diminish. It's possible that people will have less value for the products, will be willing to pay less money for the products that universities have traditionally offered. I mean, an undergraduate degree. That's possible because there is going to be less money, and because I think we've become more savvy in understanding what does that education lead to. Georgetown University has now for decades, through the Center for Studies in Education and the Economy, been producing extremely valuable information on the returns to different careers by field of study, by university. And we now know that there are many degrees for which there are no economic returns. Now, is that the only reason why people would pay for an education? Perhaps it depends on how much money you have. But if you have to borrow $250,000 for a degree that actually doesn't return the equivalent of what you paid for that, that money is going to come from somewhere. And so either you have other assets that can allow you to consume that, or it's probably a bad decision to pay $250,000 in a degree that doesn't return $250,000 over your lifetime earnings. So I do think that this pandemic is making those who consume education more discerning about what they need. There will be new customers who are ready for new products and who are willing to pay for that. And some universities will respond to that opportunity, will be able to respond, and others will not. I do expect that there will be, in the US, I served for 7 years on our State Board of Higher Education in Massachusetts. And I can tell you that the challenge, and higher education is an important industry in our state. I don't believe that all of our universities are going to survive this crisis. I don't believe they would have survived without the crisis. They essentially had, to be very crass, broken business models. They were, what it cost them to produce what they were producing was greater than what they were able to recover. And that probably is also true for the individuals. What it was costing them to access that education was greater than the returns that produced. So that kind of dysfunction, unbalance, needed a correction before the pandemic, and the pandemic maybe is going to accelerate that. I mean, we've seen cases, right, of for-profit colleges here essentially scamming people, selling degrees that have absolutely no value. If this pandemic has the effect of wiping all those things from the face of the earth, frankly, I think that would be a very good thing.
Thank you, Professor Reimers. Thank you. If there's no additional comments, I just muted myself. For the next question, I mean, we all know that COVID-19 definitely also impacted the world of technology and digital factors. You know, obviously nowadays students are a little bit more hands-on with technology and so on and so forth, not because they have, well, because they have to, but also, is this going to be a beneficial factor for some fields, you know, for students? And for the next question, which also ties into the different technology advances that schools are starting to use for virtual classes, Professor Çetinok, I'd like to get your thoughts on how did COVID-19 shift the field of medicine, and would you say that students are being provided with the same technology or hands-on performance virtually?
Thank you very much. So before I answer this question, I just want to give a little information. Do we have time? Because there is a report from COVID-19, at least a third of the world's school children are unable to access remote learning during school closures, new report says. It's from UNICEF, and it's reported on August 2020. So the numbers are important for us. Globally, the minimum proportion of school children unable to access remote learning is 31%, and the minimum number of school children unable to access remote learning is 363 million all over the world. So what affects this? The report outlines the limitation of remote learning and exposes deep inequalities in access. And the report uses a globally representative analysis on the availability of home-based technology and tools needed for remote learning among pre-primary, primary, lower secondary, and upper secondary school children with data from 100 countries. So when children have the technology and tools at home, they may not be able to learn remotely through those platforms due to competing factors in the home, including pressure to the course, being forced to work, a poor environment for learning, and lack of the support in using the online or broadcast curriculum. So, and finally, UNICEF urged governments to prioritize the safe reopening of schools when they begin easing lockdown restrictions. When reopening is not possible, UNICEF urged governments to incorporate compensatory learning for lost instructional time into school continuity and reopening plans. So UNICEF is calling for urgent investment to bridge the digital divide, reach every child with remote learning, and most critically prioritize the safe reopening schools. So it is a little bit similar for universities also. So when we come to my question, for our university, what we did, and this time we have to make our options for giving the best educational system. So we're just support our library. We use lots of ebooks, and for anatomy, if I want to talk about anatomy, we have visual systems, some kind of visual systems, and 3D, 4D learning systems, or we have visualize Googles, and that's it. But finally, I just want to say again, this is not enough for enough to students learning anatomy or medical science. So they have to, when we get the safe conditions and make that conditions, we have to start as soon as possible the normal, regular educational system. That's my point. So otherwise, for health systems or being a physicians or the other nurses or other things. So it's just lots of challenges over there to become a best health science fighters. Is it a good sense? I don't know in words, or I don't know, but we need to go back universities, practical exams, labs as soon as possible when we got the safe conditions again.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Professor. So kind of shifting on to the same, Professor Göktepe, you definitely can.
Yes, I want to share an example. I like for this virtual learning or remote learning, I always use the same metaphor. I'm holding a cup of tea now. And when I hold this coffee, I feel almost with all my senses. I smell it. When I drink, I taste it. I feel whether it is hot or cold. But you don't feel it now. You don't taste it. You don't smell it. You don't know whether it is warm, hot, or cold. So it's like that. In remote learning or online learning or teaching, it's the same way. It's really difficult. I believe it's the most important challenge to provide our students with social and emotional skills, cognitive skills and physical skills while they are away from school, from you. It's like you are away from my tea, but I'm just holding coffee, but I'm holding it. It's really difficult. I believe that I feel like this is the most important, most difficult challenge. And what happened, as soon as we found ourselves in this pandemic period, as teachers, we all around the world, I believe, we all responded quickly. How? by implementing distance learning modalities. Maybe some schools were lucky, but on the other hand, some teachers had to run this period without sufficient guidance, training, resources. So what happened after that? The most challenging thing is teacher professional development. I think this area moved to online lesson designs, for instance. So teacher, they may know how to use this digital tech tools, but they may not know how to design the lesson for online teaching. So design of the online lesson is the most important, one of the important items, I think. But unfortunately, some teachers didn't find, they missed out such a support. So it's really challenging. I think we have to, as professors mentioned, maybe if let's say that, take myself as an example. If I'm competent of designing these lesson plans, online lesson plans, if I knew how to do that, I have to find different ways, the best ways in order to disseminate this competency, I believe. So I think we need to take responsibility all together and help the others. Thank you.
Perfect. Thank you so much, Professor. So in consideration of time, we also want to give a little bit more space for the audience to also ask questions and for our panelists to answer them. And also a note, if you do have a question, please submit it in the Q&A section below. As I am still learning Zoom, I think you'll be able to find at the bottom of your Zoom screen. So to kind of wrap up the final discussion, I wanted to go ahead and ask everyone and have everyone take about 2 to 3 minutes to kind of summarize how will students and the international education system remember the 2020 academic year as, and what lessons have institutes taken from this global pandemic? If anyone wants to go ahead, we can start with Professor Harris if you're ready.
I think it's hard to predict what people are going to take away from it. I think different people take away different things. Again, I think to me, the most important theme is that different people, different places are going to be affected in very different ways. But I do think things will change. There's actually a question from one person in the audience about whether this is going to eliminate classroom teaching and fundamentally change higher education that way. I don't think it's going to change it like that. I think, I said earlier that it's going to infuse technology more into learning, and I use that word infuse deliberately because I don't think you can very easily replicate the in-person learning environment online. You can, there's very good online programs. There's no question about it. It's not cheaper, and there are limits. I think the way Professor Göktepe was describing about the senses and the degree to which you can really engage with people online, I think there are inherent limits to that. And when we think about higher education, that part of the value of it is actually moving to a new place and a new community and physically being there. That's it's not just better because you're in a classroom for an individual course. The higher education experience is much bigger than just the classroom. So I think people want that, especially young people want that. So and I think they miss it. I hear from the students, and they were very excited just to be coming back to campus, even if the campus itself was fundamentally changed with social distancing and so on. They were eager to come even to this radically reoriented campus environment. So I don't think it's going to replace the classroom environment at all, but I do think we can make teaching better by using technology better and by allowing for opportunities for new kinds of networks, new kinds of interaction, but that are still fundamentally have to be rooted in in-person relationships.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Reimers, would you like to go ahead and comment?
Sure. I mean, I don't know how people will remember these, but I certainly hope that my students remember it as follows. As I mentioned, I work with students whose vocation is to advance public education around the world. And my hope is that they will remember this time as one where they were able to be of great service, of great value to others, as a time of great meaning. You know, look, no one chooses to be in a pandemic, just like no one chooses a war for themselves or a cataclysm. So the real question is not about whether we had to live through this moment. The real question is, what did we do in that moment? And what I hope my students and my graduates will be able to say when they are asked, what were you doing at a time of the greatest educational calamity in our lifetime? I hope they will be able to say, we did everything within our power, within our reach, and even more, to sustain not our educational opportunities, but the educational opportunities of those who had a lot less privilege than we did. That's what I hope they will do. Now, with respect to the earlier point, you know, is this going to transform higher education and so on? I think it will transform it, but perhaps less radically than we imagine. Do I think this form of teaching is a substitute for face-to-face? Of course not. I mean, I've been locked down in my house for 6 months. Do I like it? No. I love to see my students. I love to see my colleagues. I love to come to my office. I'm not allowed to come to my office right now. But that's not the relevant question, really. If you look historically, Humboldt, who I mentioned, the founder of the first research university and the founder of the first public education system, had been educated by a tutor, which is the way people used to be educated until we had public schools. And those tutors were phenomenal. I mean, his tutor took him to France in the middle of the French Revolution to see what a revolution was like. Why did he have a tutor? Because his father was a general in the Prussian army. He was a very wealthy man, and he could do that, which only very few people at his time could do. When the public school was invented, if you had asked anyone, is that comparable to the tutor Humboldt was? The question was, of course not. It's a very poor substitute, but that's not the relevant question. The relevant question is how many more people can have access to a public school than had access to a tutor. And I think the same is true for technology. For us, for example, at Harvard, the university made an unprecedented decision in a matter of a week. I had been for the last decade advocating for us to begin online instruction in my school for degree programs. And I was always hitting a wall in that said Harvard will never authorize a degree program that is fully online, that doesn't have a residential requirement. And in a matter of a week, our governing board, the Harvard Corporation, said, well, we actually are going to give every school the authority to decide how they want to handle this year. And my school said, we're going to be fully online for a year. And frankly, it caused some trepidation among the faculty. What is this going to look like? But I'll tell you what we did. We reopened admissions. We had already admitted a class. We reopened admissions. And I can tell you that the class that our admissions process for the online degree was 10 times more selective to our already selective process. I can't give you details, but one of my students, for example, is a former Secretary of Education of a country, an amazing woman who had wanted to come here, who could never do it because she has many demands. And all of a sudden, she can be in a master's degree. Among the people we turned down in this process, we have a former president of a central bank, a former ambassador of his country to the United States. This is how selective the process was. If you ask me, what is it like to teach your students? Well, it's a whole lot different. Do I miss all the meetings we used to have, all the dinners, all the parties, the students coming to my office? Yes. Would I love to share a cup of coffee with them where I could smell their coffee and they could smell mine? Yes, I would. But that's not an option. But I am actually teaching a very different group of students. And you know what? I think we're all gaining. If we judge what we're doing in terms of how it helps us advance our mission, which is to be of impact in the world, I think we're in a good place. So I don't want to sound Pollyannish and make us wish that we had lived through a pandemic because of all the things that it enabled us to do. This is a disaster. I want to end in that. It's a calamity. But the real question is not, we don't choose the cards we're dealt. We only choose how we play them. And I think in universities, we are, those of us certainly who work in them and also those who access them are the most privileged humans in our humanity. And I think with great privilege comes great responsibility to play our cards well. And I think that's the opportunity that we have in front of us.
Thank you, Professor. Professor Çetinok, would you like to go ahead and make a few final remarks?
Sure. So I just want to share my experience, what happened before this panel. I have a classroom, as I mentioned before. What's going on in Turkey, I just want to share my experience. So the classroom is almost 120 students I have. And first we introduce ourselves and they introduce themselves. And then I ask, okay guys, do you want this lecture continue online or do you want to come to the classroom? 98% student want to attend campus here and they want to continue their education in this campus. They just wanted that. And then the second question is what we're going to do for this, because we are get bored and we are have a lots of concerns about we're going to get effective education or not. And our psychology is not good, so we don't, and some of the students, 4 or 5 students just want to continue the education online, and their excuse is one said, because I'm not living in Istanbul. The other says, okay, this is better than that one. But most of them want to continue their education face-to-face. So, and they're trying to reach their dean or the university, head of the university. So the students wants to continue education like this way. For us, it is not easy for us because, because 2 students asked me, can I read or can I attend a lecture or listen to the lecture from records? Because I said, his excuse is, I don't have any time that time. This is the excuse. So this is not good for my professor at that time attend the meeting. And then he said, okay, you're going to be a health science profession. So how are you going to say this to your patient next time? So if they continue their education here, I think it's more disciplined and more effective from other ways. But what we're going to do now, first, their psychological is not, how can we say, because this is a different era. This is a digital era, as we know. As Professor Reimers mentioned before, we have some kind of pandemic experience before at 19th, 18th century before. But now these are the digital era children, students, and they are, it is not easy to make them happy. Because of, I know my kids, because of my kids. So we are trying to push effort. We are trying to support their psychologically, and I give my mobile phone, my own number, and they're still writing their problems, their concerns, and I'm giving individual psychological support also. In Turkey is like this. So, another thing, our internet access, online access is perfect here. We don't have any internet problem. But as you know, the electricity or some kind of other things which affects the electrical or internet system maybe affect, not frequently, rarely maybe, but in here online almost all students attend the class, and we did 2 hours lectures, online classes. So but all of them, most of them wants to come to the campus as soon as possible. And what how we gonna remember this time? It is a huge, unique experience for us because we are not ready this pandemic, because we don't know. This is a different era. I told this before, because it is a digital era. There is a different kind of wars now. Yeah, we know some kind of wars in Middle East or other are continuing, but here we don't know how to fight with this virus during the beginning of the pandemic. Now we know how to fight, how we take our measures, but it affects socially, it affects psychologically, it affects economically. So it is not easy time for us, but we know we continue to learn, and we have to know how we're gonna live with this kind of conditions, because I'm worrying. My concern is what's gonna be happen after this COVID-19, because it is still a black box, for my opinion, because 2 of my colleagues passed away last 2 days. They fight with the disease, and they went their home. And last night, one of my colleagues passed away because of we don't know, is it comes from viruses, the reason for viruses, or other thing. But finally, our professors know that it comes from the viruses. It affects the heart muscles, and it's affect kind of heart diseases. And then we lost him. So we still continue learn this virus, and we don't know what's going to be happen on the vaccination. And there is still some arguments continue, but we have to work on fighting with this virus, fight with these conditions, and we have to learn as soon as possible. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Professor. And Professor Göktepe, would you like to make some few final remarks?
Sure. Yes, I did some research about the students' reactions about this year, actually. I'm going to articulate a sentence which is not mine. The other couple sentences I also got from some articles. So it's the school year for the history books, actually. Now we said World War I, blah, blah, blah. We just mentioned them. We got some examples from history books. Now we are inside of it, actually. So it's the school year. I won't say it is the school year for the history books, actually. But we don't know how this pandemic experience affects students throughout their lives. And I think it's unclear how it will impact on the psychology of our students, as Mrs. Çetinok mentioned. It's not clear. In future, we're going to see that. Researchers will, I'm sure they will do some researches about that. They will have some papers about that. And on the other hand, what I found, some online tools like shifting roles of students, parents, and teachers. What is this? Some online tools could shift the role of teachers by making them more like coaches and mentors. It's really good. I mean, sometimes some online tools can point students to a very good online lectures, and then there to provide guidance and feedback and to make connections across topics. So by using these online tools, you know, during the pandemic, most of the companies like Amazon, they all opened their resources. It was a very good decision. So students with all this rich open sources, no matter what type of sources they are, they took the responsibility of their own learning, which is very important for teachers. You know, if a student takes his or her learning responsibility, it's really good improvement for us. And here I'll share some examples that I liked. One student, a high school student, grade 12, I think, he says, I think a lot of people learn to appreciate the presence of a class and a teacher, and how much it actually helps you to learn. They really missed this face-to-face education. And another student says that we learned time management. I've learned time management and self-care. And it's not only in academic area, but also they miss the special events, special day ceremonies like graduation ceremonies. It's a pity that they didn't have this mass event. I believe that things never be the same, but I hope, of course, we're gonna have different scenarios for future, because nobody had this simulation or scenario. Even in my school, emergency management policy has different scenarios. We are ready for different scenarios. But for this pandemic, pandemic situation, we didn't have any simulation or scenario. But from now on, all the world will write more scenarios. We will get ready and do some simulations. And I think this during this time, teacher professional development is also got a good place in our agenda. Teacher competencies, teacher development are really important items that all companies or institutions, universities should have teachers also. They should work hand in hand, actually. So my last word is, as Darwin states, not the strongest, but the most adaptable to change will survive. I hope we won't have this pandemic again. I hope we can survive. And maybe hope to get an online courses from Mr. Reimers. Why don't we work with Harvard University? I hope we will have a chance to get some courses from you for dissemination. To disseminate good examples is really good. So if universities support teachers and the teachers will support their students, so it will be a nice chain between us. I wish the best to all. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor. So we are actually out of time, but we do have enough time for one question, if that's okay. Otherwise, the questions down below, our panelists can actually answer them individually, I believe. If not, I could definitely email all of them to each of one of you. There is one question that I think that a few of our panelists can be able to answer, and this is a question from our audience, and it says, how can we help improve critical thinking of our students? You went into the role of critical thinking in Berlin, so that's why I wanted to ask. So the main question is, I would ask how we can help our students in terms of critical thinking.
Engage them in solving real problems. Problem-based education, project-based education is nothing new. It's a wonderful opportunity for students to develop the capacity to apply their knowledge to solving problems and to integrate what they're learning in different disciplines. And this pandemic creates an abundance of opportunities of that sort in all kinds of fields, obviously most directly in public health, but also in business, in education, in public policy, in a variety of fields. So that's what I've been trying to emphasize throughout the talk, that this is an opportunity for us to connect our instruction more directly to being of service to society, not as a way to do charity or just extension, as a way to advance what is core to our mission, which is to prepare students to make a difference in the world and to advance knowledge on issues that matter.
Can I add something to Professor, what he said? Okay, I said when I hold this cup of tea, really coffee, it smells great. I cannot make you to feel how I feel it. But as you said, if we assign a project-based assignment, homework to students, we can have them to feel what I feel now. Of course, depending on our lesson objective, our curriculum. So this is the most important thing. That's why the lesson design is very important. Okay, I can describe you, I can tell you it's like this, it's color, everything, but it won't be effective as he or she does a project-based assignment. Thank you.
Perfect, thank you. And like I mentioned before, all the Q&As, because of time frame, all of our panelists can definitely answer them individually, or if you'd like, I could definitely send them by email. So on the behalf of Atlas Grad Institute, we would like to thank each and one of you for sharing your insights on this matter. It was a very informative webinar. I'd like to remind our audience that this past Monday, we did celebrate World Teachers Day. And we wanted to especially thank our panelists and all teachers around the world for helping all students to learn and cope, even through a global pandemic. Your efforts are definitely recognized. To remind you all again, a full recording of today's webinar will be posted on our social media platforms, so please make sure to go ahead and follow us using our name, Atlas Grad Institute. Once again, thank you all for your participation, and we hope to see you all in the future. Thank you, and we wish you the best of luck.
Thank you very much. Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.
Bye.
Thank you very much. Bye.